It's my great pleasure to introduce to my right Mark Simmonds, who's going to chair this evening's discussion. Mark was previously our Minister for Africa, but has since been promoted to be Vice President of FFI. So it's a great pleasure to introduce him. Mark, over to you.
Thank you.
I'm going to leave that there.
Well, good evening and welcome once again, everybody. And could I say how pleased and thrilled I am to be chairing this evening's distinguished panel, particularly here in this wonderful RGS building. And thank you, Andrew, for that extremely warm and courteous introduction. That was certainly better than an introduction I received from a rather nervous gentleman who was chairing an event that I was speaking at when I was the United Kingdom Minister for Africa. He said, and I quote, "I'd like you to give a very warm welcome to the Right Honourable Mark Simmonds, the United Kingdom Minister for Africa, whose debatable skills we saw in Parliament last week." We're here this evening to discuss an extremely important issue. The title of today's discussion, the panel discussion, is Land Matters, the Successes and Challenges of Conservancies in Kenya. There are both excitement and challenges around the Conservancy movement. This is an issue which underpins wildlife conservation in Kenya and has been a recurring question throughout FFI's history. Indeed, the term conservancy is defined in the 2013 Kenyan Wildlife Act as land set aside by an individual landowner, body corporate, group of owners, or a community for purposes of wildlife conservation. But does a network of national and private conservancies and growing urban development still hold a future for viable populations of large migrating mammals? And what does the future hold? Of course, this issue is wider than wildlife conservation. Who has rights over the land and its resources, particularly in light of the changing climates and increasing scarcity of water? What are the political implications, and where do humans fit with the Conservancy movement? This evening, we're going to invite our panelists about their perspective on these issues, considering the immediate and long-term future. And we're very lucky this evening to have four such distinguished and expert panelists. To my immediate right is Dr. Helen Gichohi, who you'll be all pleased to hear has flown in specially from Cuba to be with us this evening. Helen is a leading Kenyan ecologist and most recently has been the managing director of the Equity Group Foundation. Prior to that, she was president of the African Wildlife Foundation and still serves on the board of the AWF, as well as Old Pejeta Conservancy and also the Laikipia Ranching. She was previously on the board of the Kenya Wildlife Service. And it won't surprise you to hear she's a recipient of a number of prestigious awards for her services to conservation. Next to her is Professor Patricia Mbote, who has flown in from Miami to be with us here this evening. Patricia is a professor of law at the University of Nairobi and an advocate of the High Court of Kenya. She has studied and taught around the world and has consulted for many international agencies. She's widely published and is a renowned thinker on land rights and environmental law. She is also a board member of the Liwa Conservancy in Kenya. Next to Patricia is Dickson Kaelo. Dickson is the founding chief executive officer of the Kenyan Wildlife Conservancies Association, which is a landowner-led membership and organisation representing community and private conservancies in Kenya. He has extensive conservation experience and is a member of a number of conservancies in Kenya and has internationally recognised for work with communities and landowners to conserve and benefit wildlife. And Dickson has flown in from Nairobi to be with us this evening. And last, but certainly not least, at the end is Richard Vigne. Richard is the son of a tea planter. He was born in Western Kenya. He studied zoology at Newcastle University and thereafter worked as the operations manager for a safari company in Uganda and Congo. In 1994, Richard returned to the UK to complete a master's degree in management for agricultural development prior to taking up his current position of CEO of the old Pejeta Conservancy. Please welcome our 4 panellists. Now, Helen, if I may, I'm going to start with you. Could you perhaps just articulate to us some of the history and early impact of conservancies in Kenya?
Thank you very much for that introduction. Good evening. It's a real delight to be here to talk about conservancies, partly because I have been involved in their evolution in the country. They are an interesting and developing story, and really we are just at the beginnings of what I consider to be a huge change within the conservation sector in Kenya. And I say interesting, one, because I've been involved. I have seen them, I've seen them grow. Interesting because of how long it has taken. Interesting because of how much time we've all engaged, many of us with the sector. And also more interesting to see where we are at and the prospects, the prospects they hold for the future, and not just for conservation, but also for community human development, for private land conservation, for space, conservation of space. Recently, I would say they have become formally and legally supported mechanism, and they have become the organizing mechanism for conservation outside protected areas in the country, especially with the recent enactment of the Wildlife Act in 2013. The Wildlife Act of 2013 that became effective in early 2014. And what that did was to set stage from where we are now. It set stage for some quick and important reforms that we had clamored for decades before. What has happened recently is those reforms is, in order to embed the new law, there's a new policy that has recently been developed, and Patricia will be going into that. We have developed regulations to really give life to the new law. There's a strategy, a 5-year strategy in Kenya for the really first time, really thinking about how we can take this new law, embed it, and get government to help implement and translate it into realizable results on the ground, both for conservation and for people. And then also one of the other recent developments, and I'll come back to a little bit of the history, is the development of a national wildlife conservation called Conservancies Association, which is headed by Dickson, who is here with us, and he'll be telling us a little bit about what that does and how that helps to organize, to structure, and to give fresh impetus to the conservation movement in the country. And it's a vibrant organization. And again, I would say interesting because we have a history of such failed organizations. We're littered with them, and it's taken us a long time to really get to where we are. So a little bit of the history itself, and to say that the law is new, the conservancy movement is not new. Conservancies are not new. The work of forming and creating conservancies actually began when I was really young, before I finished high school. And I won't tell you how old I am. And in the 1970s, the first non-state conservancy-like protected systems, sanctuaries, came into effect. They were used for tourism. They were used for wildlife gain. We went into the 80s when a lot of the conservation non-governmental organizations and NGOs began to coalesce and support the development of conservancies on community lands, with our early involvement in places around Amboseli, in places around Masai Mara. Dickson was extremely young at that point. I don't know whether he will tell you his age, but I saw him grow and kind of sharpen his teeth in attempts to do conservancies. In the 1990s, there were new developments that really helped to shape and helped to speed up the conservancy movement, and they had to do with various policy pronouncements that were made by Kenya Wildlife Service. They were not law, but they were sufficiently supportive. USAID gave a lot of money to try and get community conservation as a movement going. FFI was involved. People like Joanna Elliott, who is in the crowd, were involved in really looking at how you could translate, how you could embed conservancies, but also how you could create a business model around economic models around development of those conservancies. But the true impetus took place between 2000 and 2010, when a lot of the large conservancies came into force, when trust lands with NRT and a few other organizations began to really take shape, and we had huge amounts of land being put under conservancies. And so, as I speak, so you're wondering, so what's new? A lot of it is not new, but there are developments that really are helping to shape and to evolve in a more formalized, in better context, within a better institutional and legal and policy environment, which is really important if you want things to develop and to become embedded as national developments. It's very important that they're embedded in law, they're embedded in policy, and they're embedded in practice. So what am I saying? That conservancies developed in a vacuum. They developed without law, they developed without much policy, because of the strong drive by conservation community stakeholders, by communities to harness wildlife, to harness land resources, to harness what they had at their disposal as development assets. And early drivers were conservation organizations. There were tourism business owners who wanted to work with communities, who wanted to give back, who felt restricted being in national parks. But also importantly, there was concern that we were going to lose space. Kenya, East Africa, is your typical savanna. If I may use a bit of ecology, double rainfall, short grass, sweet grass plains, so huge mobility between space. And so when you set a protected area that's only a few thousand square kilometers, it doesn't cover the needs of elephants. It doesn't cover the need of pastoral livestock. It doesn't cover the need of wildebeest. You can imagine the huge influxes of wildebeest from the Serengeti coming into the Mara and finding a tiny little park when they could disperse over thousands of hectares. So there were all those interests that came together to really help to develop and shape the conservancy movement. And so, just a little bit more of the models is that because they developed in this vacuum, we had time to experiment. We had time to try things out. We had time to evolve things. We had time to have discussions and debates and throw things out, throw things in. We had time to disagree. But also it was very frustrating. And I was one of those very frustrated young scholars growing and trying to get space as an ecology secured. And so they have developed different models in ownership, in the institutional structures, in the type of governance that is managing, running these entities, in size. Richard presides over 100,000 acres. You have some that are 400,000 hectares. So the size also matters. And the kind of enterprises that are in those is also highly variable. If you look at the objectives, historical and current for their formation, again, they are even more varied. There are those who want conservancies because they want to consolidate and secure land tenure. There are those who want to exploit tourism resources. There are those who are worrying about their grazing, and do I have enough for my cattle to graze? There are those who are looking at social development returns, economic returns from them. There are those who want jobs. So they have developed, for reasons that are different, members of those conservancies themselves also see the value and see the possibilities of those conservancies from very different lenses. Whether you're young, you're old, you're man, you're woman, everybody looks at them and has different expectations. So I think this evening it was going to be really interesting to just hear the legal, the community, the private, and to kind of just see how it's shaping out, how it's shaking out. But also to hear about what the prospects are, because what has happened with the enactment of the law is given a structure. It has created interest among communities. We always wanted this to be community-led, landowner-led, and for the first time, it's not conservation organization-led. It is actually being taken by the true owners. And the real owners are not the conservation organization. They're the communities, the people who own land. Because if space for wildlife is to be secured, if space for livestock is to be secured, if the future of ecosystems and the wildlife in Africa, in Kenya, is going to be secured, it really does depend on those landowners and their ability to see this as value to them, their ability to get value out of it, and their ability to help the continuing evolution and development that must take place in the next 10 to 20, 30 years.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent introduction to the architecture surrounding conservancies in Kenya. Patricia, could I turn to you to say a little bit about the legal structure that exists and whether you think it's hindered or helped the process of conservancies, and also perhaps where that legal framework might evolve to?
Okay. Thank you. Good evening. Basically, it's very good that Helen has raised the background, looking at the lacuna or the vacuum that was there. And that vacuum was there in terms of the recognition of community land rights. There was no recognition of community land rights, and actually the policies and laws were geared towards making communities go individual. And if you look at the policies on land, the encouragement was for communities to either get their land titled into individual holdings, or in the arid lands where most conservancies are, to establish the group ranches, which would have group representatives holding title on behalf of the others. And all those had actually shortcomings, because the people holding the titles could actually parcel the land and allocate themselves the pieces of land because of the lack of recognition of the whole community as an owner of land. Besides the lack of ownership rights, there was also a very strong government policy for agriculture. Agriculture here just plant and neglect actually of pastoralism. And this therefore meant that most of the policies were looking at settled agriculture, whereas there are very many parts of Kenya where wildlife coexists with livestock, and settled agriculture actually is incompatible with that kind of model. And the lack of focus on pastoral communities and the way in which they hold land basically meant that there were incentives, not direct, for communities to parcel out their land, even when it was clear that the use of the land is best kept as one large piece. Some of the areas that Helen is talking about, like Amboseli, areas around Kajiado, have been parceled out, whereas the pastoral communities living there still need large expanses of land to move their animals. And of course, one has to look at that policy and legal vacuum within a context of a changing climate and pressure for land resources, as well as a growing population, which means that wildlife is competing for space with humans and other uses that humans put land to, such as settlement, a lot of growth of settlement areas, which takes up lands that would be wildlife lands or conservation lands. And these, again, this pressure then meant that without laws and policies for community land holding, and then the absence of a national land use plan, which would actually designate certain areas as zoned for wildlife and others for agriculture and others for settlement, that everything was happening everywhere. And that's why the Constitution of Kenya 2010 is much celebrated by many people, because the Constitution did many things, and I'll only focus on those aspects of the Constitution that addressed the land issue. The Constitution has a whole chapter on land, and that chapter recognizes not just private land and public land, it recognizes community land, and actually describes community land as land that is held by groups which are joined together by commonality of interest, by ethnicity, and by culture. And I think for Conservancy, the issue of commonality of interest is a very critical one, because that means that if you have groups that have used land together as land that wildlife is on and they've been grazing on it, they could actually be established as a community. And the Constitution also puts a premium on regulation of land use, bringing into sharp focus the need to plan the way land is used. And under the Constitution, a number of laws have been developed, and a Community Land Act was passed just last year. The delay in coming up with a Community Land Act denied the essence that having the conservancies established, not having a way of holding land that gave a foundation for the conservancies was a big constraint, but that was addressed in the Community Land Act passed in 2016. And under that, there are very clear structures that are established for managing community land. And it's still too early to say how effective this will be, because the regulations under this act are still being developed. Suffice it to say that if you look at the act as one that comes under a constitution that is very strong also on conservation and also very strong on land use planning, then there is space for conservancies and for sustainable land use. Stopping at the Constitution would be wrong without talking about the new governance structure that was established under the Constitution, the devolved government. Kenya now has 47 counties, and those counties are responsible for a lot of issues that happen at the community level, which is where conservancies are established. Each county is expected to develop an integrated county development plan. And actually, the last time I checked, all of them have an integrated county development plan. And I think that provides a very important interface and entry point for conservancies at the lower levels, because if we are dealing with conservancies just looking at the national level, then that's too far above where people live. And because there are local structures now that one can engage if you want to look at how a county is developing. There is a county assembly, there's actually a county governor, there are county ministers, and those are spaces that actually are facilitative of the development of conservancies. But that again comes with, it's like a double-edged sword, because once you have county government, there has been a very sharp rise in people's sense of belonging and identity, which is linked to land. And that can facilitate conservancies development or actually be a barrier where people think that developing land means converting all of it into built-up areas. And in essence, the two issues is, should everybody have access to a piece of land? That's a very strong narrative drawn from the constitutional debates, but also now coming from the county narratives and the current politics that we are having in Kenya now. When people talk about secession, they're actually talking about identity and about belonging, which could actually separate landscapes. Then I think at the end of it, what we need would be innovative ways of holding land that actually facilitate the use of that land for wildlife conservation, but also for people's livelihoods. And that calls not just for community land rights, but also individual or private owners of land, and also for public actors, because sometimes we fail to recognize that government, like in Kenya, I think 8% of the land is protected areas, and those are landscapes that need to be interconnected with where communities are and where private conservancies are. And finally, I think there is also the need for local communities and Kenyans to identify with the imperative of community conservation, of wildlife conservation. We shouldn't have conservation happening away from people's livelihoods, because at the end of the day, people want to lead a decent life. How can that happen within a sustainably managed ecosystem? Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. There's a huge number of very significant issues that you raised, some of which we'll have hopefully time to return to in the Q&A session. Dickson, could I ask you to just elaborate on the final point that Patricia was making about the impact on communities of conservancies, particularly bearing in mind your long-standing involvement across a whole range of conservancies in Kenya?
Thank you very much and good evening. I think really thinking about the value of the conservancies as we have it in our country today, I think it's to a large extent a little bit too early to determine that. Majority of the conservancies that we have in our country are between 10 and 15 years old. So it's still a developing story, but I think I can describe it as a story of restoration of hope. I grew up in the Masai Mara and grew up amidst wildlife. And at some point, as I was growing up, I did feel that wildlife were going to disappear in my village, and the childhood experience that I had will not be enjoyed by my children. I personally began working in the conservancies about 18 years ago. First of all, as a member of the Conservancy, but also as a community member who have had the opportunity of undergoing some training in natural resource management. And I came in working with a lot of partners to see how our wildlife can be secured. And at that particular time, a lot of things were happening. There was massive die-off of wildlife. Elephants were being slaughtered. I saw quite a number of dead elephants, and a lot of them without their faces, with their tusks being removed. I saw a lot of communities that were becoming destitutes as a result of having wildlife, and actually becoming extremely negative of wildlife, and saying that the protected areas are designed for wildlife. What is wildlife doing in our landscape? And I think looking back within the period that I've been working, I see between the first time we developed the first 2 conservancies next to the Mara to date, we have now 160 conservancies across the country. They are spread in an area covering around 11%. And I think this is significant because we live in a country where only 8% of the land area is under conservation, yet wildlife are utilizing slightly more than 25% of the landscape, and a bit more if you consider all the different species. And this 11% is an additional in terms of land area that is coming into wildlife conservation. The whole conservancy movement, as we call it today, have evolved in many ways in their governance, in their institutional structure, in the kind of benefits they are generating to the communities. We have now 64,000 square kilometers of land that potentially is available for wildlife. And I think that's very important because we do have some of our national parks, like Amboseli, some of you may have been there, is only an area of about 300 square kilometers, with elephants nearly 4,000, requiring 5 times more than that space. And so there is really no hope that elephants can be sustained within that protected area. And so I think the contribution of space is a very big addition. And we have now nearly 700,000 households involved. That translates to about 4 million people that are actively engaged in these conservancies. Some of them are rangers, and our community rangers have doubled up our ranger force. Kenya Wildlife Service has nearly about 3,000 rangers. The conservancies collectively bring in another 3,000. actually 2,900 to be specific. And these are community members who begin to become stewards of wildlife, and they utilize the network that exists within the many community members that live with this wildlife. And what we've seen largely is that the gap that used to exist between the communities and the wildlife authorities is now closing up with the ranger force that now exists. Our organization, Kenya Wildlife Conservancy Association, basically have been working with a lot of these conservancies and the regional associations, we have 12 of them, to begin to address the gaps and the challenges that the conservancies are having. And one of the things that I would like to point out is the fact that the communities now do feel that they're involved in policy making. In the development of the Wildlife Act that Helen talked about, that came into force in 2014, the Community Lands Act that Patricia talked about, there were a lot of engagements at the community level, and many of them began asking, what's happening? Because we were never consulted, we were never involved. But because of the institution that these conservancies is creating, it is now beginning to provide a platform for which communities get to know that there are policy reforms that are going on and actually begin to contribute. And they do that in their own conservancy structures with their chairman, their committees, their conservancy managers, and that is escalated to the next level where we have the regional association, 12 of them, as I mentioned earlier, and then it cascades to the national umbrella association at the national level. And we have now a better Wildlife Act, a better Community Land Act as a result of that engagement. A lot of the recommendations that came up actually got into adoption because of that ability to engage by having institutions. I think the other one is from the communities actually getting some sense of pride that actually we have a name, we have an institution, we have a governance structure, we can actually transact, we can actually even enter into contracts with third parties. I think that also has brought in a lot of hope in some of these areas that are very marginal, that are very dry, that are very far-flung, and often have security challenges. The conservancies have become a source of employment. 4,800 jobs have been created over the last 10 years for those that are involved in conservancies. We have 118 tourism facilities that some of them are really, the best you can find anywhere. Some of you may have visited. Those that haven't, I would really encourage you to do. The conservancies have created a platform where tourism investment will have now become a reality in the community areas. And this is something that previously was very difficult because now there is an institution that you can engage with, you can enter into a contract with, and that contract is going to be binding and secures that business. And I think we are seeing the biggest growth of our tourism in the conservancies. First of all, because of the ability of a camp or a tourism facility in a conservancy to provide a wider range of options for the visitors. So in the park, most of the time is come in at 6, you have to go out at 6, you cannot be outside the vehicle, you cannot do this. There are maybe 16 different things you cannot do. And in a conservancy, because of the nature of perhaps in some cases low wildlife numbers, but also the flexibility that the conservancy institution creates, we are seeing very innovative things, walking safaris, bicycle riding, picnics and night game drives, and all these things begin to become a possibility. And that is generating incomes to this household. And majority of these areas are pastoral, and livestock is the main livelihood option, and we are having more frequent, more severe droughts. Livestock is becoming less and less a livelihood that any family will want to survive with. But because it's so important in their culture, and also it still generates quite a bit of income to the household, having a second option to diversify, it has become really an important thing for most families. And so what we see a lot is the conservancies becoming a multiple land use, where livestock is being kept, tourism is being developed, additional entrepreneurship activities are being developed, and that actually creates a safety net that is required, particularly during drought when a lot of livestock die. We've just come through one and actually still persisting in some areas, and we have areas that households have lost nearly all their livestock. And their inability to come out of poverty is constrained by lack of diversification option. And so the Conservancy provides that platform for diversification. But I think more importantly also from our wildlife perspective, if you look at the distribution of wildlife in our country, only 10% of wildlife is in the parks and reserves, 25% in the Masai Mara, 65% is in community and private lands. And so really to secure a bulk of our wildlife, we have 42% of our black rhino, 72% of our white rhino, 90% of our hirola, 90% of our gravy zebra. And the fact that a lot of these conservancies are adjoining these protected areas creates ability for wildlife. And especially it's becoming more and more important as we get into these recurrent droughts. Wildlife are also dying for the first time. In the past, as a Maasai growing up in Maasai land, I had never seen an animal dying of drought. Now we are seeing, more recently we saw a lot of buffalo, a lot of zebra dying, and really to survive in this landscape, it has become even more important to move and to move further and to move to different land parcels and to create that ability where we have, on the other hand, a big shift towards expansion of cultivation, a big shift towards settlement, a lot of infrastructure developing. It's becoming a lot more constrained. And so having conservancies midwifing that landscape and really creating options for not only wildlife, but also livestock to move is really becoming important. And I see a lot of value in sort of going forward.
Thank you, Dickson. I'm largely encouraged by your remarks, which I sort of interpret as really quite optimistic, which is very good news for the future of Conservancy. Richard, could I just turn to you to make a few remarks as the CEO of a not-for-profit Conservancy? And I think what I would find very interesting is to get your thoughts on the challenges and the issues that relate to maintaining large landscapes in a Conservancy.
Thank you. Yeah. Good evening. I think, I mean, as you're hearing this evening, the way conservation is practiced across certainly Kenya and large parts of Africa is definitely transforming. I sit in the private sector, and we're one of the biggest private conservancies in Kenya. We hold the single largest population of black rhino in East Africa. And that in itself is a massive challenge. Looking after rhino is a complicated business. The cost of rhino horn these days is around about $70,000 per kilogram if you can get it to Vietnam. So looking after those rhinos across approximately 400 square kilometers is very costly, and it's something that most people don't want to get involved in doing. But when I was asked what the biggest challenge was to looking after Old Pejeta, and in fact nowadays land beyond the boundaries of Old Pejeta, my simple answer was that it's human populations. The fact that human populations across Africa are growing so quickly means that the way we do conservation has to change. And new models for conservation, the achievement of conservation space, are going to have to be developed. And we can't take too long to do that. It's going to happen very quickly. So the old style of sort of national park fortress conservation, in my mind anyway, simply doesn't work anymore. And it's clear, as you've heard this evening, that in a continent where you've got these growing human populations, plus linked to that this huge demand for land ownership, that if we're to retain the kind of significant herds of megafauna, I'm talking about elephants, but also other species, then any approach to conservation is going to have to find ways of addressing human needs as a prerequisite for success. And I think for me, that's the message that the Conservancies are all about. I think in Kenya, we traditionally have always felt that conservation is something that takes place in a national park. But actually, you know, when you talk about conservation, we really shouldn't be talking about the sort of preservation of wildlife for preservation's sake. The truth is that we humans all depend upon the the ability of our ecosystems to provide services for us. We all need clean air, we all need fish in our seas, we all need adequate pastures if you're a pastoralist. And the fact is that what we need from the list of what we need from nature is almost endless. And so, you know, when we talk about conservation, I think we need to widen the conversation. I think it should be less about rhinos and elephants and much more about the business of conservation and how we transform it into something which everybody is involved in, and how we potentially transform it at the level of local livelihoods into something which people can profit from and therefore invest into. Instead, I think as a planet right now, what we're doing is we're consuming our natural capital as if it were income. And what we should be doing is looking after our capital in ways which are sustainable. And that is the challenge, but it is the challenge that I think conservancies, to some extent, have the answer for. What I would say is that if we are to look at this from a more human-centric perspective, then we probably have the answer to the question about how to preserve large open spaces going forwards. The truth of the matter is, if we as humans deal with the systems within which we live as systems which provide us with services, and we deal with them in a way which preserves the provision of those services, then with a little compromise and adjustment, we actually can automatically provide the space for those other occupants of the natural world who live alongside us. So take river flows in Kenya across large parts of the globe, I'm sure, but in Kenya, particularly in the arid areas where conservancies tend to exist, are increasingly compromised in dry times. And that's all to do with over-extraction, it's all to do with the cutting down of the riparian areas, and etc. And of course, where the riparian areas are cut down, you lose all of the occupants of those areas which would normally exist, the birds, the insects, the bees, the butterflies, and everything else. Similarly, as most of you or some of you will have seen in the news over the past 18 months, in Laikipia, which is where the old Pejeta Conservancy is based in Kenya, we've had massive problems with pastoralist invasions of private land. And the reason for that is again, this kind of exploitation of our natural capital as if it were income. We've exploited it to the point now where it can no longer provide the income which to a pastoralist is the supply of grass. And as a result of that, those pastoralists are being forced to move into other areas of the country which are perhaps better managed because they're in private hands. And that's what we saw in Laikipia this year. Of course, what we've got actually is a situation now where those pastoralists have no option but to come to those private lands because they have degraded their own lands to such an extent that even with sustained rainfall and no livestock, those lands are going to take an awfully long time to recover. But there are alternatives to that approach, and again, this is what the Conservancy movement, I think, is all about. It is possible to have managed herds of livestock. It is possible to manage the rangelands better. It is possible, actually, to make those rangelands more productive than they currently are, even before they became so heavily degraded. And the byproduct of that, for want of a better word, is that where you have well-managed rangelands, primarily for the purposes of looking after livestock, you also provide the opportunity for wildlife to thrive. And that, in turn, provides an opportunity for wildlife tourism. And frankly, our wildlife tourism, when we get it right, is unsurpassed anywhere in the world. So that is the kind of the goal of many conservancies, and something which is probably achievable certainly over the next few years. So what am I saying? What I'm saying is that the human-centric approach is actually the basis for what many people have referred to as the scramble for conservancies in Kenya. They're not primarily set up as a mechanism to somehow preserve Africa's wildlife, but much more as a means to provide the governance process where, with good environmental stewardship, human needs are provided for, and where economic opportunity thus starts to evolve. And that, for me, is the role that they should continue to play in the future. And as I've said, wildlife and the persistence of wildlife and ecological process will probably tend to happen in many of those conservancies as something of a byproduct, not simply because wildlife was somehow deemed to be important to the global community. I think we are a good example of what is possible in the private sector. We took a view at the very beginning that we were going to try to maximize land productivity at the same time as creating space for conservation to persist and thrive. We wanted it to be replicable, i.e. not dependent upon the donor community. We wanted it to benefit humans as much as possible, as a means to buy for ourselves political relevance and a future. And we wanted it to also foster the emergence of the wider conservancy movement in Kenya as much as we could. And we've done that by, as I've said, maximizing land productivity in ways which 10, 15 years ago would probably have been thought, certainly in the private sector and certainly in the national park sector, as almost unthinkable. So the first thing we did was integrate beef production, 7,000 head of cattle, across the wilderness wildlife areas of old Pejeta. And we were told at the time that that would never work, that tourists would never want to see cattle, that we could never run a profitable cattle operation in the face of wildlife numbers, wildlife populations. But we've proven that that's completely untrue, okay? What we've shown is that actually the two combined can be more profitable and more productive than the either or, that is the either cattle or wildlife and tourism. We've also got some of the highest populations of wildlife in the country in that system. So we've challenged the mindset that wildlife must exist only in a national park. We're providing a land use opportunity which allows wildlife to persist even in the face of human activity. And I think that really is the crux of the Conservancy movement. Right now we employ nearly 1,000 people. We pay tax. We've got the biggest herd of black rhino in the country, and we've got some of the highest populations of predators in Kenya, recorded in Kenya. So that is what is being, to some extent, copied, certainly in the private sector, across private conservancies, and it's definitely an example which community conservancies are increasingly beginning to pick up on. Of course, there are challenges. We've heard some of those challenges this evening. We do, in many situations, have pretty inappropriate legislation, which leads to an inability to consummate some of the other opportunities that may exist in terms of maximizing that productivity and benefit for people and providing the perception of more value in wildlife and conservation for people than currently exists. But those are being addressed to some extent by some of the legislation which has been recently introduced. The truth of the matter is that there will be no more national parks created in Kenya. 8% of the land in Kenya is national parks at the moment, as you've heard. And if those big herds of elephants and other species are going to continue to persist in Kenya, then we have to find alternatives in terms of land use and land ownership across which those herds can continue to persist. So the Conservancy movement, whilst it's embryonic, whilst it's faced with many threats, really does, in my mind, led by the private sector to some extent, but owned by communities, provide an opportunity for rural, traditionally marginalized Kenyan communities to begin to thrive alongside wildlife in a mutually beneficial relationship, which is equally value, where both wildlife and humans are equally valuable to each other. So that's it.
Richard, thank you very much. I'm aware that time is ticking on, and I am quite keen to give an opportunity to some of you here this evening to ask questions in a moment or two. But before I sort of turn to the floor, I just want to ask each of you, if I may, a question in turn. Try and frame your response in the context of where we go from here in the future. We've heard a lot about what's got us to this stage, I think. And Helen, if I could start with you, it'd be very interesting to get your perspective on the interconnectedness between protected areas and conservancies. We heard from Dickson that some of them are geographically coterminous, but not all. Is there sufficient policy framework in place to have a uniform perspective, or is it still very much islands, if you like, at the moment? And if so, what needs to change?
I think what the full conservation movement has done is really allow for connectedness. If you look at where a lot of the early conservancies began, and I said they were initially driven by the interest in allowing mobility and space for both wildlife, livestock. And as Richard put it, is because there is mutual benefit between having livestock and wildlife coexisting in the same space, because the resources they use, there is quite a great separation, if you will, between what an elephant eats, what a buffalo eats, what a cow eats, what a goat eats, and what a Thompson gazelle eats. So in this space, once created, it has huge value and huge benefit that allows the diversity that is Kenya's wildlife to survive. And because they were driven by those early interests, they were of necessity then contiguous to protected areas to begin with. So if you look at the early conservancies, they were around the Masai Mara National Reserve. There was concern that those group ranches should not be subdivided. And again, as Patricia said, it was because of the value both for wildlife and livestock. So the Group Ranch Act had made it clear that the space and the size of those ranches was an imperative for livestock. And so wildlife became a beneficiary of a law that was actually set with livestock in mind rather than wildlife in mind. And so when you bring them together, what they did then was connect uses and values that were very complementary. And so we simply went outside parks and began to look at those dispersal areas. We then realized that actually, if you look at the movements, there were areas that were already settled, and you needed to find corridors. So the next thing was, how do you create conservancies around much smaller spaces that could then serve as corridors? Because if you create islands for an elephant, typically what will happen is that they will eat themselves out of house and home, if you will. And that is partly what happened in parts of Tsavo when we had a huge growth of elephants. They destroyed their habitat, and there was a crash in the population. If you go to the island parks in Kenya, the Nakuru National Park and others that are fenced, you get these ebbs and flows, and wildlife numbers grow and then they crash. And we wanted to avoid that because Kenya is known for these big, vast ecosystems that are used by both people and wildlife. So the next step was to then create the corridors that then connect. So that is where the beginnings of the conservation movement were. But if you look at a lot of the growth now in conservancies, it is in areas where we do not have protected areas. So if you look at Laikipia, where Richard is working, Laikipia is the second most important wildlife conservation area in the country. There is not a park. I think there was only a small one created not too long ago. And what that has, the reason that wildlife has persisted in this area was because of the connections, the connectivity between private lands and open community lands, trust lands that have been developed as conservancies. Fences have been opened where there was interest by individual landowners to fence off their wildlife. They realized that actually mobility was to their benefit as well. So fences have been opened and created connections between private areas and conservancies, community conservancies. And so the push is for open, for space, for movement. With changing climate, even more important. Richard has talked about the influx of cattle from the north into Laikipia because of poor land management. And the same thing would happen is that if you close off your islands, when you close off areas, what you would have is not necessarily the same kind of mobility. These cows can move because the space is available. What you would actually have are those repeat die-offs of populations. So as climate changes, it's really important to provide the freedom for movement for both livestock and wildlife. So it becomes an even greater reason for making sure that we do not create islands for conservation. Yeah.
Thank you, Helen, very much. Patricia, you mentioned a very important issue in your remarks of land use and obviously the legal framework around land use. And as we've heard, there are pressures of urban expansion, population growth, for agriculture, both arable and livestock. Can you just say a little bit more about what you think in terms of the legal framework needs to change to cement conservancies in the legal structure and the associated land use to reduce some of these pressures? And if so, how does that fit with the 47 counties model, the changing the constitution? Because I suspect, from my own knowledge, that some counties will be more enthusiastic about this than others.
You know, if one was to read the law alone, the Kenyan law is very facilitative of good land use management. And if you look at the constitution, I said the issue of land use is right there. Every county in Kenya has an integrated land use development plan. And there's a lot of talk about land use planning. And if you look also at the Community Land Act, the Wildlife Act, you look at the Physical Planning Act, the law is not the problem. I think the problem is implementation. And some of the laws, like the Community Land Act, I said is very new. So the implementation is going to be the point at which we see how effective that will be. And because we've only had counties for 5 years, and this is the second cycle of counties, I think we're going to see more and more counties now put a premium on land use. Because many counties can see that land use that is not sustainable is actually impoverishing the counties. So this is a developing story, I'd say, as Helen said, that we will see how land use planning becomes embedded in development of spaces in counties. But the one thing that remains elusive is a national land use plan. We've been trying to come up with a national land use plan, and we make a lot of progress, and then there's pushback because, of course, of vested interests. Because if a particular area is designated for a particular land use, that may mean that this haphazard development won't happen. And landowners who've already begun to enjoy the benefits of the land, like those who are able to sell their land for private development for occupation, may not want it now declared to be conservation areas or areas for agriculture. So in essence, I am optimistic that with counties there is positives, but we need to really ensure that implementation is done to ensure sustainable land management.
Thank you. Dickson, can I ask you to build on your, I think generally, as I said before, optimistic remarks, just to sort of project forward 25 years or so as to where you see the conservancy movement in Kenya moving, and whether you could say a little bit more about how they might be economically sustainable. You mentioned in your remarks the attractiveness of greater attractiveness of tourism. Do you see that as the only potential economic sustainable element of conservancy, or are there other things that need to be looked at as well?
Yeah, I think there are quite a number of things that needs to be looked at sort of going forward. And I think where conservancies have succeeded and they have made a lot of progress, they have become quite successful. The case that has just been presented to us by Richard as a good example, I think they become victims of their own success because they generate more grass, they have more water, they have more benefits that are coming up, and they are surrounded by a lot of unhappy people and a lot of people who do not have that pasture, do not have that water. And I think although the Laikipia issue was more shared, I think we saw a lot of the other areas where conservancies have succeeded. In the Mara is a good example that conservancies began growing grass. And during drought, these conservancies has more grass than anywhere. And in the Mara, for example, although it was not well in the press, we had livestock moving all the way from Loitoktok, which is another 100 and maybe close to 200 kilometers to come into the conservancies. And so I think the challenge that we do face today is we have only a few conservancies that have really began to show some level of success. And that is quickly eroded when you have a drought and everyone else wants to come in and to access that pasture. And so what that means is that it needs to be more scaled out. We need we have nearly 30% of the conservancies in what you would call at the formative stage. You need to grow that out. You need those that are sort of in the middle, because we have a huge disparity between, variance between the conservancies that are doing well and those that are struggling, and everything in the middle. And so you need to grow a lot more conservancies to become more established, to grow the area they cover, so that the people in Samburu, the people in Turkana, for example, have enough conservancies to generate enough grass to help them stay there during drought and not want to go to the neighbors and forcefully acquire grass. And I think that is a challenge. And to get there, I think we need to think about a lot more about the capacity of the community institutions that have been established, a lot more training of those that are managing the resource. The rangers needs to undergo a lot more training, and also I think we need a lot of investment, because I think in this sort of transition period, there will be need of external investment, but both in building the capacity, but also to begin generating other avenues of getting resources and getting funds. And tourism is a big one, and in my opinion, are exploiting maybe a tenth of the potential. There is still so much potential that needs to be developed, and a lot of investment that needs to come in. I think, and also growing that, looking at alternative wildlife compatible land uses, and I will see the conservancies of the future beginning to, at the minimum, look at 5 different ways of generating income and collectively contributing to a larger pool of income. I think the issue that has Patricia has already talked about of the policies. We have now a strong Wildlife Act. We have a Community Land Act, but these policies are not being implemented because of reasons of government having funds, and that needs to be strengthened. I think also the issue of right to ownership of the land. Those that are in community areas now have an act, but they are not actually, they don't feel strengthened, and those that have on leasehold feel that, that land can change. And so that strengthening of that land rights needs to happen a little bit more. So we need to see the Wildlife Act being implemented a lot faster than it is, the Community Land Act being implemented faster. And now we are considering option, for example, around creating a national conservation fund that creates ability for these conservancies to build their own enterprises, build their own capacity, and actually begin to become engines of their own success. And we need to compete with other land users, because there is an opportunity cost to creating a conservancy. And a lot of people are beginning to ask, maybe I can get more if I did wheat. Maybe I can get more if I did maize, for example. And with the developments in the agricultural sector, drought-resistant crops, irrigation becoming accessible and cheaper, we see a lot of the conservancies will begin asking, is this the best use for my land? And so really going back and beginning to see how these conservancies can generate a lot more of the benefits. But I think also, conservation has an intrinsic value, beginning also to realize that, and beginning to get also the government and the county government. More recently, we have about 3 counties that have stepped in and said, these conservancies are going to be our platform for community development, because they provide an institution that the county government can invest in. And so more support from national government, from the county governments, will actually steer a lot of the younger emerging conservancies. And we have, I think, currently about 40 communities that approached us and said, we have this fantastic landscape. we don't know what to do, but we here, there is something called a conservancy, and will it apply in our area? And so as a membership organization, we are thinking about standardizing the way they are managed, and actually being able to be pragmatic at some point and say, this cannot become a conservancy because of the challenges.
Thank you. Richard, I'm going to come to you in a minute. Helen wants to make a quick comment.
Yeah, I think I was just going to add to what Dickson is saying, is that, to say that education, I think, is going to be a very big, an important consideration for the future of conservancies. And we were talking earlier about population growth, and Richard has just mentioned it. And it's almost an imperative that you give people economic mobility out of the land, out of these conservancies, because in the absence of that, what you will find is that the population density grows, the resources you're generating are not going to be sufficient to go to a huge number of households. So a lot of the early benefits of conservancies in health, in education, are going to be really important. So amplifying that, delivering them in a better fashion, I think holds some hope for getting more off the land, so they're not completely reliant on rural landscape for their development.
Richard, I picked up 3 key themes out of your remarks. The first one was the importance of the private and the positive role the private sector can play. The second was how important good management is. And the third was the importance of humans within the conservancy scope. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about the latter, particularly about the economics of humans in a conservancy area, and also perhaps how that might fit with terms of acceptable land productivity, and whether organisations like FFI have a role in conjunction with your team on the ground and others in the conservancy movement in Kenya to help build the capacity.
I think, Dickson talked about it, the opportunity cost of conservation is generally speaking massive. People setting aside land to conserve in the traditional model are foregoing other opportunities on their land, which, as Dickson says, can be incredibly valuable. So this idea that you previously couldn't keep cattle because there was wildlife, which is currently the national parks model, is making it more and more difficult for conservation space to be created and, in inverted commas, set aside. So the whole issue for me of sort of the importance of humans is that if somehow we cannot create within human populations the idea that conservation, or at least space for conservation, however it is set aside, is somehow more valuable than other potential forms of land use, then it will cease to exist. And that's something which you see in various areas around the Masai Mara, but as Dickson has said, when you get, in the face of drought-resistant crop varieties, growing human populations, demands for food, and so on and so forth, there's a kind of inevitability about it. So for me, the whole human thing the whole human-centric approach is really about finding, and I also happen to have a view that a lot of the way conservation is practiced in terms of its ability to generate value for humans is sometimes quite inefficient. There are simple examples when you look at the national park system of Kenya. I think the national park system, and I've had this conversation with the Director General on a number of occasions, should be making many millions of shillings from retail opportunities in exactly the same way that you would see it in a museum or other sort of public facility in places like the UK. But they don't do any of that. What they do instead is they go to governments and say, well, we haven't got enough money, you need to give us more. That becomes a burden on government, and it becomes something which, in the face of other demands upon limited public finances, is difficult for government to finance. So I think as conservationists, we need to do more from a commercial perspective to make more value from the conservation asset that we are trying to create, with a view to that then becoming more valued by humans and their ability to take value from it, so that they in turn act as the primary motivators behind creating the kinds of integrated models that will allow conservation space to continue to persist. So just to reiterate the point, for me, this is, and I think most people, most conservationists would agree, this is actually all about humans. It's about creating value in the conservation, in the way that conservation is perceived. And until that happens, then conservation will always be threatened.
Thank you. I'm going to take a couple of questions from the floor, and then I'm afraid we're going to have to draw it to a close. There's a gentleman at the front. Is there someone? There's a hand at the... Please wait for the microphone. I hope there's a microphone's on the way. There's a gentleman at the front here.
What I see is a big obsession with livestock husbandry in Africa and Kenya in general. In the colonial era, there was a limited amount of livestock allowed to be nurtured on the landscape, and now you see an unsustainable level of livestock ownership owned by some few powerful individuals, and the rest of the communities are left in abject poverty. Is there any way that the livestock numbers can be reduced?
For those of you who didn't hear, because it was a question about the sustainability of livestock numbers and whether the livestock numbers current livestock numbers could be reduced. Richard, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think the difference between the colonial times now and now is that in those days there were 5 or 6 million people in Kenya, and now there are 45 million people in Kenya, and the population, as we've discussed, is growing. And a lot of those people, the cultural imperative in those communities is to own as much livestock as possible. So it's an intractable and very difficult problem. If you look at the history of pastoralism around the world, it's tended to come to an end because as human populations have grown, the model of pastoralism, which is to roam at will in search of pastures, has been lost. And therefore they've had to change. And I think that's probably what we're going through a little bit now in Kenya. I think there are some other big issues. I think pastoralism is a fantastically profitable business. I once sat with a guy in a place called Malacca, and he had, 100 sheep or something. And he was a very educated guy. He was university educated, if I remember. And I said to him, this business of keeping livestock, tell me why it makes sense. And he explained it to me. He said, look, I know I can go and take that sheep and I can sell it for 2,000 shillings. I can put the money in the bank and I'll get 10% interest, which is what is possible in Kenya. But I also know that sheep, if I keep it, will give birth to 1.5 lambs on average per year. So I'm effectively, that sheep is earning me interest effectively of 150% per annum. So as long as I can keep it alive, plus its progeny alive, and by the way, I'm not getting taxed, it's worth my while sticking with pastoralism instead of going to the bank. So but it makes sense in many respects. So I think we have to change all of that, as well as changing, it's going to be a function of education, it's going to be a function of providing other opportunities, it's going to be a function of providing that value that I talked about. In other words, I'm not going to keep sheep and goats in vast numbers. I'm going to invest my money in something else, some other opportunity which is provided to me. And I think it's going to take an awfully long time for it to happen. But also there are obviously the politicians, the cattle barons, and that's a different subject altogether.
Thank you. Helen, do you want to make a comment?
It's a bit the livestock is a challenge, I think, for reasons of management, especially land management. But if you look at Kenya now, and with recent counts on livestock and wildlife, it's actually one of the times when we have low numbers of livestock. And what has been happening over successive years because of the poor management is that the ability of many of Kenya's lands to carry livestock has gone down considerably. And so what you find, and especially if you look at it from an ecologist standpoint, is that with every repeat drought, the ability of the grasses to recover and to support more livestock is compromised. And what has tended to then happen is that cattle numbers haven't grown as much. What has grown are sheep, and they are more damaging to the environment. They are more damaging to those areas and cattle. And correct me if I'm wrong, Richard, because they are very intense. They're very intense grazers. And so what I think we need to do, one, is to continue to push, because I think livestock as part of cultural practice has been very hard. It's been very hard to change the way of life of pastoralists. And while you could and have for some of the more proximate group, a lot of the far-flung groups where livestock is life. Livestock ability to have that sheep, the goat, the cattle, is really their only means of sustainability, it becomes very difficult to simply wish them away. And partly what I think we need to learn, and we were talking about this earlier in a different forum, is just how to begin to restore rangelands, because we don't have the skill for that. It exists somewhere else. We need to find out how to restore. But we also need to get the law behind this question of management and get land use planning, land use zoning. And it's nationally, we do need to get beyond having a conversation about zonation to actually actualizing it, because that's the only way that we will be able to contain and reduce the mobility, which in of itself is not bad, because having cattle move, having pastoral is actually what is keeping livestock, it's what is keeping wildlife going in Kenya. If you removed and wiped away the need for cattle, I can tell you wildlife will follow suit quite quickly, because that imperative is taken away, and right now is a huge imperative. So it's how to integrate it better, how to manage our lands better, how to develop off-take mechanisms, how to develop abattoirs, how to develop a better, much more efficient livestock industry. It is very inefficient right now. Meat is very expensive in Kenya. We're bringing in a lot of meat from elsewhere, so we're not even growing enough for ourselves, but yet we've completely destroyed our landscape. So something is completely wrong at a systemic level, and we just do need to re-engage, and land and land policy are really important questions in issues of pastoralism.
Thank you. There was a hand that went up there. Yes, I can't see that.
There's a lady.
Yes, a lady there.
Thank you very much to the speakers. I think that was very insightful. I have but two questions. The one is that are there issues of human-wildlife conflict in Kenya, especially the conservancies, and how are those being dealt with? And particularly in communal conservancies, are there issues of financial mismanagement? And again, how's that being dealt with? Thank you.
And there was a gentleman down here who had his hand. I'm going to take two questions at once, and then I'm afraid that'll have to be it.
I may have missed a point, but I wonder if you could tell me where the migration of wildlife comes into all of this.
Thank you. So the first question was about financial mismanagement, and the second question was about migration of wildlife. Dickson, do you want to have a go at the first question?
Yeah, I can actually try to. I think yes. One of the biggest growing threats to wildlife is human-wildlife conflict. It's perhaps much more impactful than actually poaching. But I think it's actually a symptom of a bigger problem, which is the spatial use of land by wildlife and people. What we've seen in some areas is once you create a conservancy, by definition, a conservancy introduces some level of planning. And what happens in some of the conservancies is you begin shifting population of humans into certain part of the landscape, keeping other parts of the landscape open for both livestock and wildlife. And what you do with that is that you begin to minimize the level of interaction between wildlife and livestock. And in many of the conservancies that are now beginning to establish, we actually quickly notice that there is a decline in the number of human-wildlife conflict incidences. First, most importantly, because of a bit of land use planning. Again, the Conservancy has been used as a platform for developing human-wildlife conflict mitigation measures. Part of the reason we see a bit of the conflicts today is the decline in the management strategy of livestock. And you see more deaths because of hyena, because of leopard, because of lions, because the cows, the livestock, are now herded by children and young and women. And so the adults, pastoralists, have sort of abdicated that responsibility of herding and handed it over to younger people. And predators are very smart in terms of assessing the threat presented by the herder. And what we are seeing now is a lot of the conservancies that the rangers are involved in identifying where the lands are and beginning to inform the pastoralist which areas to avoid because there are lions. reinforcing bomas where the cattle are staying in the night, lion technology. We have young people in our country that have come up with very simple but smart lion systems that have been demonstrated to deter predation, especially at night. And a combination of that becomes a really powerful tool in minimizing the number of conflict. But I think, yes, you're very right that really conflict is a big issue and one that needs to be addressed. But also when people begin benefiting from the Conservancy, what we have seen is a quick shift in thinking, and people become less interested in poisoning, become less interested in spearing and retaliatory killing, for example, because now they begin seeing that this is a resource that is valuable to us. And I think the more that those benefits can be allowed to flow, the more we have communities that can tolerate some level. I don't think you can ever eliminate as long as people and wildlife coexist, but I think you can reduce it to a level where it's not impacting on wildlife, but also you can make the communities a lot more tolerant in most cases. But
Thank
I think,
you.
yeah.
Sorry to cut you off, Dickson. We're running out. Patricia, it would be remiss of me not to ask a lawyer to comment on a question of financial mismanagement in the Conservancy area. So perhaps you'd just like to address the point that the lady raised.
Yes, I'd like to very quickly, also from a legal point of view, address the issue of human-wildlife conflict, which raises compensation questions, because in the process of coming up with a wildlife policy and a wildlife law, what concerned many communities was actually compensation and the issue of who pays when there is damage, like loss of life or loss of livestock or destruction of crops. Who pays for this? And I think these continue to be questions, and I think having conservancies that diffuse tensions is important, but also ensuring land use planning that separates what humans do or makes what humans do compatible with wildlife conservation. On the issue of good management and financial probity, I thought that Kaelo would be better suited to answer that, because I think the question was very specific. Have there been issues of financial mismanagement? I'd be speaking to it more generally, but you can speak to it more specifically.
Richard, do you want to comment?
Yeah, sure.
Briefly.
There's been plenty of financial mismanagement. I think the way that it, what is interesting about the Conservancy movement that I think I try to kind of talk about is the idea that it's about governance more than anything else. It's about an opportunity for communities to coalesce around a common goal where their governance structures are set up such that if misappropriation or misuse of funds occurs, boards can be changed, et cetera, et cetera. So you quite commonly find now in some of the better administered conservancies proper rotation of board members, regular elections to the grassroots levels of board members, and so on and so forth. And all of that over time begins to mitigate slowly against the possibility of people misappropriating funds. So it's getting it down to the grassroots. It's about ownership. It's about the little old lady with a couple of sheep having a say in the way that the Conservancy is run and holding people to account. And that really is what this is all about. It's much more about governance than anything else, in fact.
Thank you. Helen, do you want to briefly address the gentleman in the centre's point about the wildlife migration?
Migration, yes. And just to make one final remark on financial management is to say that partly what has emerged as conservancies are developed is much more transparent systems, where sometimes you're actually announcing how much is being earned, how much each family is receiving, how much is going to education, and making it public information. And that is what is actually driving some of the changes, that there are mechanisms for developing transparency that are being improved upon. Migrations, why are they important? Where do conservancies fall in this? For Kenya, I said it's double rainfall. So it means our grasses grow pretty short. So in an area, after you've had a rainfall, one of the rainfall seasons, the amount of grass that grows is going to support wildlife for only a very short period of time. So if you're trying to feed an elephant and you've had 1 month or 2 months of rain, in about a month, 2 months, the grass is gone. And what then it requires to do is to move, to go off and find the next place where the rain, where the rain has fallen. So it is a means to track access and access resources in time and space. And so our region, unlike Southern Africa has one very long rainfall. So there is hardly any movement of large herbivores in the way that you have in East Africa. Because we have too short grass, animals have to track. And so if you ask Richard, for example, he knows when elephants will be completely concentrated in Pejeta. I think you will know when wildebeest come in when they go back to Tanzania. They go back to Tanzania when it's raining. They come back into the Mara when it's dry, because the grass in the Mara is slightly longer and lasts a little longer than what you have in Serengeti. So think about it as availability of resources because of tracking where the rain is going. That's what migrations are about.
Thank you. Well, I'm afraid we've already run over time, so I am going to have to draw this discussion to a close. And for those of you who had your hand up and I couldn't take questions, I apologise. I think it's been a really interesting panel discussion. We've talked about the challenges, time, economics, wildlife, numbers and movement, land pressures, livelihoods, interaction with people, land use planning processes, economics, population growth, pressures from urban areas. But the great theme that I've taken out of the discussion has been the positive impact both in the past and the present, and I think in the future as well, of the Conservancy movement in Kenya. People feel involved in policy making. There's legal recognition of land rights, communality of interest, restoration of hope, sustainability of wildlife, more attractive to tourists. The private sector manage better both wildlife and rangelands. It's been a wonderfully stimulating, engaging, rewarding, worthwhile and informative discussion. Please thank our panellists, Helen, Patricia, Dickson and Richard.